Hello, everybody. It's Monica. I am here to tell you a story, and I have been working on this story for about 17 years. It's really interesting to me the way that the story came about, and the story has spoken itself or told me about itself for these 17 years. And a part of how the story has come together has been in the telling of it. So I would write a little bit and then discover this whole world. And the way that I work with language may be different than the way that other people work with language. And so I will have an image, and then there's this whole world that I get to explore. And that's really part of how this story came about. Actually, I'll just tell you a little bit of the origin story of this origin story. I used to, when I was younger, write in journals. But I would only write when I was like really upset. It would be like, oh, this problem is going on. And then I like use it to process. But then I had these journals that were full of just like crappy times or times where I was just complaining. And I carried these journals around and I was like, ugh, I don't want to read these books. I don't want anybody else to find these books, you know? But sometimes I still want to write. So what else? What else could I do? And so one day I sat down and it was like, I want to write, but I don't want to write about me. So I just thought like, oh, I could just make something up, which is kind of what I've been doing, even when I write stories about me. So I just looked next to myself and I wrote this tiny little thing. And then I started writing other things. And then before long, they all kind of started to fit together and they turned into this story. And I would try and write this story down because when I would tell people, they were like, oh, that's amazing. You should totally make a book. But every time I went to write this story in like a linear way that would be like a book, it just kept on going, nah. And then I felt bad about myself because like, if you have a story, aren't you supposed to write a book? So I've just kind of like let it go. I've told it. I've stopped telling it. And then the lovely Georgia Watson, who just joined, she suggested that I tell this story during this quarantine time. And so here I am. And thank you for coming. As I said before, like the story changes as I tell it and kind of depending on who's there to listen to it. And so I'm really curious about what the story is today. And I'm grateful to you all for assisting me with the creation of it. So it all began way back when everything that was just space and energy and a little bit of wiggling. It was before all of the cosmic gases had begun to coalesce and take shape. As everything that was space and energy and wiggling, it was so much fun. All of the space and energy was just dancing all the time. And as it began to take shape, parts of itself, parts of everything would notice itself. Parts of everything would notice what they were. And there was this one bit of everything that especially loved to observe everything that was forming and shaping. And she would go around and look at and move through and get a sense of everything from all sides and all angles and really get a sense of like defining that thing. What is that? And one day, as she had been really scrutinizing something, she she got to the point where she was like, I know what this is. And she opened her mouth and out came a word. And it was the first word that had ever been created. And it was written in black letters. And it just hung there in the air. And it was the name of that thing that she had just identified. And the word hung there for a moment, and then it kind of drifted away. And everything that existed and everything that was so excited. This was a new creation. And so that character that loved to observe everything, we'll call her the namer. She went around and observed everything and scrutinized and would look at everything from a billion different angles and then open her mouth and create another word. And all of these words written in black would just hang out and then kind of gently float away. And everything loved being named. And everything would dance around with the joy of its new name. But before long, the namer had named so many things that all of those words were hanging out everywhere. And the space started to get a little bit crowded. And everything that had been dancing around so joyfully was a little bit more frustrated. And like the energy was like, ah, because there wasn't so much space. And the namer, in the midst of naming left and right, slowly discovered like, oh, I've created a bit of a mess. And she even named that mess. And she knew that she should probably clean all of this up, but she wasn't certain exactly how to go about that. So she took a moment and she realized that probably somewhere inside of her was the key to unlocking this mess that she had created. So she closed her eyes and she went inside and she started to wander around looking for what could clean up her mess. But she looked for so long that she got a little lost and she couldn't even really remember what she was doing in the first place. She knew it was important. There's a bird talking to us too. So as she was wandering around inside of herself, she came across a window. And she climbed into the window, and as she got into the window inside the building, she turned into a little girl, and she completely forgot about what she had been doing in the first place. She just knew that she was looking for something, and it was very important, and that she probably shouldn't open her mouth, because every time she opened her mouth, it didn't create what she wanted. She didn't realize it, but she had gone into the house of the unfinished characters, which is where every character that any author has ever begun but not finished, it's where they all end up. And they all come in through the wastebasket. But the namer had come in through the window, so she was very different than all of the other unfinished characters. And she came in. Now, in the house of the unfinished characters, they're all characters that seemed like a good idea to begin with, but the authors just lost interest in them. And so for the characters in the house of the unfinished characters to leave the house, they have to have a sense of completing themselves. And all of the characters are very funny. And generally, I'm very interested in other people's ideas of the characters too. So if you know any of the characters from the House of the Unfinished Characters, let me know. One that I think is hilarious is the girl with really big feet. The author thought that those big feet should be able to take her somewhere in the story, but he didn't have any other ideas, so they just fell flat. So all of the characters in the House of the Unfinished Characters, they're just helping each other out, helping each other finish who they are. And they're very generous, and they will hang out with each other all night long in the kitchen, writing these big long lists about who they are. So they'll like ask each other a bunch of questions like, do you like peas? Give them some peas. And then they'll watch them eat peas, and then they can write like likes peas or doesn't like peas, whatever it is. So it was into this place with these wild characters that the namer came as a little girl who'd forgotten what she was doing. And all of the characters ran to her and started asking her questions, but she wouldn't open her mouth. And she seemed kind of upset. And they didn't know what to do to help her feel better until one day somebody put a mirror in front of her. And it was amazing. It was like the first time that she relaxed a little bit. And she started to spend tons of time with the mirror. She would run up to it and make a bunch of different faces. And she would try and sneak up on it and like surprise herself with something different, all trying to get a different sense of herself. And the more she studied herself in the mirror, the more she discovered that like there she was, this thing that she should know the most about. But she didn't. There was still so much more to explore. She was undefinable. She was bigger than anything that she had decided she was already. And the more she began to get a sense of her undefinable nature, the more she started to kind of recall what it was that she had been doing in the first place. Until finally she remembered, oh my gosh, I made a mess. I need to go clean that up. And with that, she just opened her eyes and she was out of the house of the unfinished characters. And she was in this space with all of the words that she had left behind. And she opened her mouth and she started to sing. And it was the first song that had ever been sung. And as she sang, millions and billions and trillions of birds came flying out of her mouth. And they went around and they picked up all of the different words that she had dropped. And they started making nests. And they started creating what became the first phrases and sentences and paragraphs. And some of them made sense and some of them didn't at all. They were just a word scramble. But every once in a while, a bird flying overhead would drop a word. And as they would drop the word, it would ring out. And everyone and everything everywhere knew the word. And those words would plant. And any time that anybody else, anywhere else, used that same word, it would feed the word that had planted. And so those words began to grow. And they turned into a language forest. And you know, anytime if you want to know more about a particular word, as you say it, you can grab it in your mouth and shake your head, and you'll get some more information coming down through the roots that lead into the language forest. And everyone was doing this, and it was so exciting. They were using words all over the place, and they were getting more information about the words, and they were making the language forest grow, and they were telling stories, and all of the creatures that used words started to get more and more and more connected with the language forest. It was their favorite pastime. And unfortunately, before too long, they used so many words and told so many stories that they started to get a little bit tangled up in the roots of the language forest. And they slowly began to lose their ability to move in space because they would be so tangled by the stories that they were telling. So much so that there came a point where like people or the creatures, because maybe they weren't just people, but the creatures that would use the words would just get stuck right in place, right next to whoever they were stuck next to. But they would keep on telling their stories. And after a long time of telling stories to the same people over and over again, they started just to kind of change the stories a little bit. Like, okay, now I'm the mom. Listen to this story. Now I'm the dad. Listen to this story. And they started to kind of go crazy, in fact, from telling stories without really living them just to the same people over and over and over again. And all of the creatures that didn't use words, they didn't get locked into the roots of the language forest. And so they would kind of play with the creatures that did use words, and they would like play with them like they were little marionettes, and they would kind of move them around, or they'd throw things at them and really just have fun with them. And the creatures that were using words that were crazy would take in everything that came to them, but not really do anything but just add it to their story. So like if a monkey threw a like acorn at their head, they would just be like, ah. And they'd include it in their story. Yes, and then there was a pain in the head, and it meant that, the sky was falling, or whatever it was that they created of their stories. Their stories were so important because it was kind of as much movement as they got once they started using words. So the namer, who, as I mentioned, recognized how totally undefined she was, she was a little immune to the tangling of the language forest. And she would continue to wander around and observe everything. And she noticed that some of the creatures that used words weren't moving that much, but the creatures that didn't use words still were. And so she started to ask questions about that. What is that? And she went exploring. And she noticed that when she looked at it even more closely, the language forest and the roots, that there would be these places where the roots of the stories would rub up against each other. And they would kind of like send out these little sparks that would then go flying around everywhere. And so one day, she just grabbed a spark and she held on to it. And the spark told her the whole story, just in that one little speck that had rubbed off the roots. It had the whole story, and it was beautiful. But the longer she held it, the more she became hypnotized by it, and the less willing she was to let go of it. And she noticed herself doing that, and she dropped it. What she had discovered, it was just a little point of view. It was a little piece of the story that held all of the story. And those points of view were spreading everywhere as the stories rubbed up against each other, and they would hit other storytellers, and the other storytellers would swallow them and get enchanted by them and include them in their stories, so that it was like the same story being told over and over and over and over and over again. So the namer wondered, what else was possible? And then she had an idea. And she did this gesture. She knew what to do. And she created a little question mark. And this question mark was a way to go into the language forest, into the roots, and to pry open where all of the roots of the stories were rubbing up against each other and spreading out with their points of view. So she created this little question mark, and she started to insert it into different people's stories and open up some space within their stories. And every once in a while, she'd do that, and the storyteller wouldn't like it very much. They were so in love with their story, they were like, get away! And then others actually really did like it. They had missed having this space to move around like they had had before they started using words all the time. And so the namer would give to those people or those creatures other little question marks, and they could begin to go around and free themselves from where they'd gotten tangled in their stories, or throw it at a friend and see if they wanted to use it. And really, this is where this story is pausing at this moment. And as I mentioned before, this story has told itself to me over years. And I'm really excited to see, what is it that happens now? What is it that comes from opening up all of this space in the stories? And, you also can use a little question mark if you find yourself a little stuck in your story. Or you can just throw them around, see if somebody else is stuck in their story. It's almost like fishing for space. So this is the next part of the adventure that we get to explore and have open up for all of us. And I'm really curious. I'm grateful to all of you who have listened to this story so far. And thank you. Part of telling this story came up because Kara Wright and I have been talking about language and using words and what it's like for people who don't use words the way that others do. And this conversation about there's so many places where the words can tangle you up, and so many places where they can be quite amazing. And I am so interested. Kara and I are going to be doing some different things, having conversations about this, facilitating different classes. But it's just so amazing to talk to her and to realize, like I said, I've been working on this story for like 17 years. And there are all of these ways that each of us, and myself in particular, can play with words and language that can be such a joy. And then so different, too, than the way that others do. And then there are ways that we can use them or other people can use them that get us all tangled. So again, thank you so much for listening to this story now and in the future. And you're invited to come talk to us, whether you use words or not, about what else is possible. Thank you all so much. All right. Bye.